Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don being joined today by Dr. Eric Rush, who guided the podcast so ably last week. Eric, how you doing this evening?
I'm great. Good to be here, Don.
Yeah, and Chris, probably a good time for you to say hi to the good people.
Hi, good people.
There you go. It's not officially a Fork in Time episode where Chris is on until we've covered that little landmark. It's not real until then, at least not in my head. And today we're coming back around. We're going to be the three-man team today. The last time we talked about this topic, we had a slightly larger group, but they aren't able to all join us today. But we wanted to get back to it pretty quickly. Some of our listeners will remember. I'm looking back here now how many episodes ago that was. But we started talking, this was one of the ones that was inspired by the Christmas season. If you remember, we did a couple of episodes there, and one of them we actually looked at an event that happened in history in that time frame, which was the Battle of the Bulge. And we talked about what would have happened if there had not been the Battle of the Bulge in December of 94. And towards the latter part of that episode, hopefully our listeners will remember, we started talking about, okay, that's great. That's the theater in Europe, but what would have this all meant for the Pacific theater? And we realized, there's a whole thing to actually talk about there. And so I think we're going to cover some of that today and then some other areas. But I'm actually going to turn it over to Chris right now to sort of lead us in and bring our listeners back up to speed about what we talked about and get us introduced into the concept here. So, Chris, you want to take us away?
Sure. So basically what we talked about last time was the fact that the resources, the men and the material that Germany threw at the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge could have done a lot more good for them used somewhere else. I broke a rule of mine. I listened to a previous episode of mine. I found myself talking about the Pratzen Heights instead of the Salo Heights. That's a little bit of the 18. Yeah, I know. Mea culpa. Basically, the fork we use, or the outcome of last time, is if they don't use those materials to attack the Western Allies, they're a lot better suited to the Salo Heights and basically holding the Russians out of Berlin. This extends the war and could possibly change the map in Europe after the war. And we'll get back to that. We are definitely coming back to Europe. We had some ideas about that. But the other thing that happens actually about this time in that year was Yalta. And at Yalta, several very important things happen. One of them is the map of Europe is drawn. That Don and Eric and I grew up with on our elementary school walls. That map was drawn at Yalta. The other thing that happened at Yalta was the Soviet Union formalized their promise to the West that 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, the Soviet Union would attack Japan. This was important because the United States wasn't sure Japan would surrender on its own, hadn't seen Barbenheimer yet, didn't know that the bombs would work, didn't know what the outcome of the bombings would be, and frankly, wanted to save American lives from having to go door to door in Japan. So the Russians have no problem getting even their own people killed, so why not take the advantage of that? That's what did happen. That's what did happen, how the Bulge could have affected Asia. If those resources aren't squandered and if the war is extended, the Soviet Union probably still would have agreed to come into the war against Japan 3 months later. They were just happy to have another, somebody to fight, more territory to take over. Their main concern with the 3 months was just moving all of the troops and material they would need to. So they would have done that. It's just the clock keeps ticking in the Pacific Theater. Since we're still comparing Christmas to now February, it's the 4th when we're recording this. February of 45 is when the United States invades Iwo Jima. Not long after that is when the United States invades Okinawa at the beginning of April. And
Yeah.
all of these things, the United States is still moving forward and still bombing Japanese cities, still developing the atomic bomb, still planning to invade Japan. And all of these things are probably going to happen. It just so happens that in our timeline, the second bombing of Nagasaki and the 3 month calendar clicking over, Soviet Union entering the war, happened on exactly the same day. And we've argued about it on this podcast. There are mountains of books written about which of these two factors was the most important, or were there other factors that led to the Japanese surrender? So if you have a situation where that calendar is pushed back, where the Soviet Union is not declaring war on Japan on August 9th, 1945, if that is pushed to November 1945, the United States was planning to invade Japan in November. What do all of these different moving pieces lead to? So this was a big thing that I thought about at the end of the last episode. I probably just spent a good 5-6 minutes setting that up. Let's go. Let's think about what that does.
And actually, I wish now we had named the episode the Bulge Butterfly. I think that would have been a better way of describing it, because it is how the time, first of all, the existence or what happened with the Battle of the Bulge then affects, as you talked about, the calendar there, Chris, and the calendar that affects everything else. Because really, at the end of the day, this was lost on me until recent years, even though I felt like, because I never had a history professor or history teacher really pointed out the 3 months. Why is it when it is in August that we drop the bomb? It's because of when we have VE Day in May. That's why you're counting the days. So Operation Olympic, by the way, is what the U.S., I believe, was the code name for the U.S. invasion of Japan. I've spent some time looking at that. Short answer to say, can we just agree upon this, guys? It would have been hard fought, bloody, and difficult. It would not have been easy. You think D-Day would have been almost a walk in the park compared to this, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the estimates for casualties for that for that invasion are just absolutely appalling on both sides, both American and Japanese. I mean, there's always going to be controversy over the decisions that people made, and it's very easy to armchair quarterback decisions that were made, but it would have cost millions of lives.
Yeah, and I think the outcome, I guess the other things I just want to disagree on some when we reference this, the outcome was inevitable. Eventually, Japan would have fallen, but at what cost and what amount of time and what aftermath? And yes, there wasn't not to lessen what Chris was talking about here, the bombing. Once Okinawa and some of those other places were taken and carriers got close enough, when we could actually have more effective strategic bombing against Japan, we had that. Nothing like what you saw in terms of the air war in Europe. But there was not the same type of Marshall Plan for Japan as there was for Europe either. And part of that was there wasn't the devastation of having the land war component that rolled through most of Europe like we did there. And so the first thing I think that was outlined here that was sort of, as we were looking at some of the things on the thing, is that we talked about the map in Europe would look different, right? Before we jump back over to the Pacific thing. And actually, we have, courtesy of Dylan, who can't join us tonight, he actually put together a map. So I'm going to put that. This is a plug for our Discord channel. That's a place that I can put that. So go check out this when we post the episode there so you can see the map that's there. But just to remind our listeners, we talked about this a little on the last episode. Where do the lines probably get drawn that are different without the bulge? How much is that map that you referenced different, Chris? Where are the lines at now? And we talked a little bit about more the north-south component maybe versus the east-west in the last episode. I remember that. But just to remind our listeners, how dramatic is what we concluded probably the map is in terms of being different?
I think what we kind of suggested is God, things are so close over there that minor changes are important. I think it's more of a shifting of an axis than a real serious swapping of territories. I think one of the major things we suggested was a division of Germany rather than east, west, north, south, which within German history actually makes more sense.
Exactly. Well, you sort of
way.
have like Protestant Germany and Catholic Germany, or the old North German Confederation versus the independent states. No, that it does, and that's kind of the way that Dylan drew out the map. It really looks very much like the North German Confederation in a lot of ways. And so North-South axis, where we do not have Northwest Germany anymore. We Denmark is also part of the communist bloc, and we retain much more of Central Europe and Southeastern Europe. So Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, if memory serves, are part of the Western Bloc. So this is a very interesting. And I still think, and we'll get to this later on, because this is one of the other discussions Chris and I had, is this is putting some, communist borders on some very core Western European powers like France.
Yeah.
And this is also putting some Western aligned countries with a direct border to the Soviet Union. So this, to me, this does not feel so stable.
Yeah, the first thing that popped into my head there is there's not, my classic way of thinking about the Soviet bloc in the real timeline is this buffer built by it between the predominantly long-standing Western powers that you just outlined there, Eric, and part of it was because of Russian losses. See how many times Russia has been invaded and saved by General Snow and General Winter, right? I mean, over and over. So let's put a little territory in between us, and you don't have that aspect going on. And it's not like France and Germany have always just got along so well anyway, right? I mean, next to each other. And now you add a Russian or a Soviet border into that. You make a very different thing there. I want to go back for a little bit because I don't want to go too far down this, but it's intriguing to me. We talked about, that religious division of Germany goes way, way, way back. We're talking about centuries back here. We didn't talk about that as much on the last episode. We touched it, but we didn't talk about that. How much difference would that make? How much would religion now factor into geopolitics in Europe and this new map versus that just being a secondary consideration to the other things that are there? That's what I'm trying to process in my head.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I think it's an interesting kind of intersectional idea here. Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily just religion. Looking at German culture, the West Germans in our timeline, the West Germans looked at Nazi Germany and said that was a horrible thing, and we own it. We take responsibility, and we, have to behave a certain way because of it. And East Germans viewed themselves as the victims of Nazism. And I think if you look at historical Germany, getting back to kind of the first episode I ever did, Wilhelm II, he was Prussian. And I think there's a cultural ability in the Rhineland and in Bavaria and in southern Germany to kind of look at this. And by the way, nothing I'm about to say has anything to do with indulgences, transubstantiation, the infallibility of the Pope, none of it.
No.
But they can look at this and say, you know what? It was wrong to join with those crazy Prussians
Yeah.
and wipe their hands of the whole unified German experiment.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, Chris. I was actually thinking the same thing, is that it would be very easy. It would be even easier for to say, it's all those Lutheran Prussians that are up there in the corner, and we're good Catholic Bavarians, and we would never willingly do anything like that. Now, is that a cop out? Yeah, in large part, it absolutely is a cop out, but it doesn't stop the people from rationalizing that. And it's interesting because now you really have a kind of a Western European power structure that is heavily Catholic. I mean, you have France, you have Italy, you have South Germany, whatever that looks like, in Austria. And I'm not sure. I think about Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, and it's like, why wouldn't Austria just join them, and have a combined South German state? I think to me that seems like a real possibility.
Um, there's one problem with that
Okay.
in my mind.
Okay.
If you absorb Austria, you cannot say you had nothing to do with this.
Oh, that's true. Okay, that's a good point.
Especially historically, looking after the Anschluss, like the numbers of camp guards and SS people that were Austrian is off the proportionally.
It was enormous. It was enormous, and yeah, and there huge amounts of political pressure on people in Austria. I mean, we've all seen The Sound of Music, right? So there's a lot of that pressure on from Austrians and other Austrians to join the German military. So you're absolutely right about that. You really can't claim to have clean hands and then want to absorb Austria. But maybe it is that maybe they decide to go the more West German model of contrition. And they say, yep, that was us. We did that. It was wrong. But we as a unified state of South Germany are going to do better, and never again. And so that is a potential opportunity. And Austria is a very different place in this timeline. Austria is a purposefully neutral country. They were created to be as a neutral country in, what was it, 1955, and to this day they are not members of NATO. And support for NATO or interest in joining NATO now is amongst Austrians. I actually just looked this up for completely unrelated reasons, and it's very low. And it's like 17% of Austrians want to join NATO. They like being neutral. Well, the reason why they were neutral is not because they always wanted to be neutral, is because that was the price of reunifying Austria. And that's one of the things that I think people don't always understand, is that there was a Soviet occupation zone of Austria too, and I think we kind of focus in on the German part of that, and so but that's no longer the case here. So Austria is firmly in the Western camp, and so I think they would still have that opportunity. And maybe they don't. Maybe they decide not to do that, and you basically have Baden-Württemberg, and it looks like maybe some parts of some Hessian parts, and then Bavaria, and that's pretty much it. And everything else is in the north is communist. So maybe they do decide to just go it alone. But it's an interesting idea of whether they would combine.
And to me, the other place that goes, I agree with you. They're not going to be arguing over theology.
No.
It's the culture. It's the cultural aspects, though, that tie into that, and having more similarities among. Now, I keep thinking about a thing that's really been hitting home for me in the last couple of years, and what we're facing now is these arbitrary lines drawn on maps tend to be, the real problem. We see that in Africa, post-colonial. We see that in the Middle East, even carried down until today. And the one thing about, this sort of way that we see the map being drawn in Europe, in this alternative Europe with a different bulge, is that it's is it fair to say they're less arbitrary? They're a little bit more naturally the way you say that things might go together. For example, the north-south thing we just described here in Germany is a little bit more natural and less artificial. Is that a fair way to describe it? Am I missing something there?
Probably. I mean, I think that's right.
I think that's
And
natural. One of the other things that just glancing at the map right next door, I'm gonna go ahead and pick a bit of a fight. I
Okay.
think Czechoslovakia is broken up, but again, along it's in our
So
timeline, by the way.
The Czech part stays in the Western camp. The Slovak part goes to the Soviet Union.
Yes,
I actually agree with that, Chris.
yeah,
I agree with that.
because
That's your
in
buffer.
in our timeline, I mean, it's miraculous how peaceful that breakup was.
Oh yeah,
So we don't think about it as a breakup, especially considering what's happening, just south of there at exactly the same time.
true.
But I think this is a natural division that just with the United States in part of Czechoslovakia, and it just happens.
Yeah,
Sorry, part of the Czech Republic,
yeah,
or by the way, maybe even Bohemia and Moravia, because in the early kind of German nationalism, they were arguing about our Czechs Germans. At this point, they've gone too far. The Czech Republic is not going to join this Southern German Confederation, but there are those historical links there.
yeah. That's true.
so,
But I agree. I think you have a Czech Republic very likely, and then you have a Slovak SSR or a People's Republic of Slovakia if they're puppeted and not just completely taken over.
so the redrawn map, and again, this is why we'll encourage you to go and take a look at it. There'll be various ways to get to it. You'll find the links in the in the show notes. But that brings us much closer. It was already alluded to here. For example, now you have France much closer to Soviet controlled, Soviet occupied, Soviet influenced territories. And I think Eric, you're the one that mentioned it. There's some elements of socialism / communism that have already been existent in France. So is there a concern? Is there a concern about suddenly this, the European domino theory that we see later in the real timeline, primarily applied in Asia, suddenly being something that's much more concerned about in Europe, or am I missing the mark there too?
No, I think there's a real concern of that. I certainly think we as Americans would have huge concerns over that because France has a strong socialist party but they're a social democratic party, very very different.
Mm-hmm.
But they also do have a communist party there, and they've been fringe. But now you have a North People's Republic of North Germany or whatever we want to call it that's right across the border. There's all sorts of ways for the Soviet Union to much more directly influence French communism. And so it does make me wonder whether there would be a more significant communist influence in France, and could be in the Low Countries too. I mean, they're right across the way. So that seems destabilizing. Certainly not something that we or our British allies would be a big fan of.
Yeah, and the other part that whether it's real or not, again, they may have been more on the fringe politically in terms of influence, the ability to actually gain seats in elections, those types of things. But if you perceive the threat to be real, you start acting like the threat is real, and sometimes the reaction can be more than the actual initial thing was, if that makes any sense. The other elements in France, may have a straw man that they're going after here in terms of there really being a strong communist influence, but that plays well in hearings, perhaps somewhere, to borrow something here from the United States, and plays well probably in the ways that demagoguery works in elections as well. It's because we all know that that's pretty much a universal thing.
Well,
Yeah.
by the way, I don't think we should downplay the fear in the United States that there actually was in 46, 47, and 48 around Soviet expansion into France and into Italy. Um,
Yeah.
Czechoslovakia was initially a neutral state, and basically in 1948, the like three communist ministers mounted a coup and overthrew the non-communist ministers. So in that kind of a situation, the United States was very afraid of the French Communist Party. You're right, they were a fringe, but in a parliamentary system, you can get one or two ministries
Yeah.
and a
Even with a few
check
seats.
situation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the first foreign operations the CIA implemented was to make sure the Christian Democrats won in Italy's first election. So don't underplay the fear in our timeline of these things.
And
The other
and I
thing I'm
think
thinking,
that's
yeah,
yeah, I think that fear is there. I agree, Chris. I think I think you have it is is an even chillier Cold War.
mhm. The
And
other thing, yeah, the other thing I'm noticing, just glancing at a map, I'm wondering. This is kind of a plug for a book I loved, The Third World War by John Hackett. I don't know if people have heard of it, but it's kind of okay. The balloon goes up in the early 1980s, and it really focuses on the Low Countries, basically Germany sweeping across the North German plain and attacking into the Low Countries. I think right now in the situation we're talking, there's a huge deal and a huge credibility issue of commitment of forces from NATO to these tiny countries that are now very, very, very vulnerable.
yeah.
So
So
that's, yeah.
yeah, no, that's exactly right. So we're assuming a heavier military presence, certainly in South Germany. We would assume a pretty significant military presence, as we did and still do in what was previously West Germany. The Low Countries, absolutely, I agree that there would be a stronger military presence. What messages do we send with headquarters of NATO then? Because we talked a little bit about this in the first half of this episode, and we talked about do you put the headquarters in London? Because right now it's in Brussels, and Brussels does not feel like a particularly safe place. Or do you say, nope, we are committed. We're committed to our continental partners, and so we are keeping it on the continent. Or do you put it in Paris?
Strasbourg, Metz.
What's that? Oh, Strasbourg.
Strasbourg,
You want to put it in Strasbourg?
a
Okay.
joint French-German alliance.
I guess
Anchor
my
it there.
I guess my question is, what NATO comes along in 49. Am I remembering my date correctly
For
without
49.
Yes.
without a little Google foo here? Do we get NATO faster in this scenario? Is there more of a concern that causes it to spring? You talk about where to put the headquarters. Do we even get it in the form that it is, and do we get it sooner? Just because there's more of the concern there and the need for it to exist?
I think we do. I think, I mean, obviously there's a little post-war chaos, and so things are going to organize right away. But I could easily see NATO by 47, 48.
There's one very interesting thing that I'm now seeing on a map.
Mhm.
Without even knowing your history, what was the weakest satellite of the entire Soviet system? What satellite wanted them gone more than any one other? Poland.
Poland, yeah, and
And
Poland's their big non-German satellite. Yeah.
and guess what? There's now a western border with Poland. So interestingly enough, you kind of can have a balance of terror and fear here. Just like the United States and the West is afraid of Soviet influence in the Low Countries, the Soviets are afraid of Czech and Western influence into Silesia and southern Poland.
And well, and we were, there was a a lot of support here in the U.S. For the solidarity movement. And so,
Yes.
is there a solidarity much earlier, or something analogous to that much earlier in Poland? And I think there
I
probably
mean,
would be.
by the way, there were solidarity is just what we talk about as the more successful one. But if you look at 56 and 68 and other points and 83 throughout the entire Soviet occupation of Poland, wherever there's trouble somewhere else, there's trouble in Poland as well.
That's fair.
Solidarity is just what we know of, but they are, I mean, they were the first country to defeat the Soviet Union in a war in 1920. They will have never forgotten any of that history there. They do not, under any circumstances, want to be a Soviet satellite. And now there's a border. There wasn't before.
True.
And just looking at this map, just like the Low Countries are a giant blue kind of shelf waiting to be cut off, their entire influence in Europe is dependent upon now holding Poland.
So do we have a big military presence in the Czech Republic? Our hypothetical, 1962, even if we get to 1962, Jupiter missiles that we took out of Greece and Turkey, were those actually in Hungary and the Czech Republic in this timeline?
I think I don't think so. Just looking, I feel like they're still mile distance closer in Turkey.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting there's a deal to be made. I'd like to think there's hey, listen, we will not have the kind of troops in the Czech Republic if you don't have those kind of troops in North Germany.
Okay.
Maybe not all of North Germany, but kind of imagine the part of North Germany that is not
on the western part of the Rhine.
More so that is not part of East Germany in our scenario.
Gotcha.
So that corner up there, you don't militarize Hamburg because that is a big deal, but we have leverage in a way that we don't in our time.
So is this a different kind of uneasy peace that we had in different ways in our timeline, or is this a powder keg?
Now that I'm thinking about it, I think Europe is I think Asia is very important, and what happens in Asia is very important for that question.
Okay.
Not only because that's where all the hot wars actually wind up,
right,
but for this other reason, which is I honestly believe if you have so let's pause for a second. Let's go to Asia.
Okay.
Because we put that off for a bit.
Yeah.
Soviets don't invade. And by the way, historically, we dropped an atom bomb on Japan and they didn't react. We dropped it on them 3 days before the second one. And in the last episode, I think we talked about, we're just going to keep rolling them off the line and we're going to keep dropping them on Japan. But guess what? I think all of us are familiar.
We didn't have any more. We were fresh out.
Well, we were, we were fresh out, but depending on how long a delay we're talking about, there would be more that would have.
They could make more. It was just, I think they were definitely trying to. I think they were, it was not easy to make fissile material, and so there were some delays in that. But they could have, given some number of weeks, they certainly could have started assembling more weapons.
But what I'm thinking about is this. In the, what I think we know, and I think I've talked about this on other episodes, what was the deadliest bombing of Japan in World War II?
Wasn't it the conventional bombing of Tokyo?
It was the conventional bombing of Tokyo. And what you hear after World War II in the United States is, well, we dropped 2 bombs and ended the war. These 2 bombs were so devastating, and they actually were not as devastating as other conventional bombings we had done. They'll make the argument, well, that only took 1 plane. No, it didn't. It took millions of dollars, thousands of people to put those bombs together and make that happen. And I think one of the things that scarily may come out of a delay is this. nuclear wars are survivable. This idea that, hey, listen, like Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, all of these fire bombings, all of these conventional bombings were within the same order of magnitude as the first nuclear attacks.
So we talk about them less as a deterrent as we do in our timeline, and they become a viable part of warfare. Is that what you're saying?
I'm wondering if that's a possibility because you have Japan get 2 cities wiped off the map, but they've already had how many other cities wiped off? It's just another quiver.
The air of mystery is gone to some degree because it's like, no, this was not the fearsome weapon that ended the war. It's just another weapon. Right. I mean, it's a big step forward in a lot of ways, but it's still just another weapon.
Well, you also don't have the concept of MAD because when you're the only party that has the weapon, at least for some period of time, you have an exclusivity here that exists for a couple of years at a minimum. I mean, even if the Soviets step up their program, whatever's there, and you may be more inclined to use it before you don't have to suffer the consequences of using it, right? It becomes a preemptive thing in certain instances if you feel like you need to use it.
But even looking at Soviet doctrine and American doctrine during this period when the United States had a nuclear monopoly, it was our policy that the nuclear weapons were a balance to the Soviet preponderance, the Soviet superiority in conventional weapons. Yeah. They had things that could match us. How many people died in Leningrad? That was a conventional that they were fine accepting. So,
right. And the historical thing that we've had there, we've talked about this, I know, on a number of other episodes, is this idea of, depending upon where you have existed in the world and your history colors your thinking about, not about the value of life. We all value life, but about the value of life counted up in quantities like you're talking about here. If you've lost, I've seen numbers for the Soviet Union, 20 million potentially in terms of, military casualties and civilian casualties of what goes on there on the Eastern Front. The devastation of conventional firebombing or the devastation of 2 nuclear weapons, relatively speaking, we look at it, we go, it's horrible for all the reasons it is. Again, one life is horrible, but you do the math a little bit differently based upon what your experience has been.
Because our total losses were about 400,000, Don.
That number sounds right. That number sounds right to me. Yeah.
I mean, it's at least the right the kind of the right scale. It's at least the right order of magnitude. And so
civilian losses being essentially nothing in that, right? Those are actual service personnel that lost their lives.
So so that is a comparison that we look at and we're like, wow, gosh, all of these these 3 events together represent a probably roughly equal number. Whereas the Soviets look at this and say, that's a rounding error for us. I mean, it's just so yeah. I could easily see where they would be perfectly willing to to take more casualties. So Chris, in this case, so what I think I'm hearing from you is Japan sort of shrugs off the two bombs, and they don't surrender. And do the Soviets then jointly invade with us, or do we invade by ourselves?
I think we probably wind up invading by ourselves because we were 2 months from invading anyway.
Yeah.
So the question is, how long of a delay does it result in? And I think 2 months is believable.
I think 2 months is believable.
So we're going to invade by ourselves.
Okay. And so we were invading in January of 46 or November of 45?
No, it was November of 45 is when Olympic was going to go in.
Gotcha.
March of 46 was Coronet on Honshu, which is the main island, capture of Tokyo.
And so how long does this take?
I can't imagine that being less than 18 to 24 months to actually fully pacify.
The 2 years is what came to my mind. So now we have a we have and again, it would have happened. I think, Japan's ultimate defeat was a given. It's just, how long and how dear was that victory going to be, and we find out very long and very dear. And it is, so we are early 48 probably, when we're finally signing peace, a treaty or surrender with Japan.
By the way, I'm not even sure if that's how it happens.
Okay.
I think, I talked about the Soviet invasion as one factor. I talked about the use of nuclear weapons as one factor. There was another factor. I honestly believe, and this is amazing to think about, letting Japan keep the emperor, which, by the way, is something we could have said before Iwo Jima, before Okinawa.
Yeah.
Basically, when we've recaptured the Marianas and the Philippines, we can tell them, if you'll walk away, let us occupy, but you can keep a figurehead. Maybe that works. The United States tried to use nuclear weapons. And I think, this is one of those things about a crowded couple of weeks here. There's decades where nothing happens, and there's days when decades happen. And August is one of these. August 1945 is one of these times. And I think one of the things the United States did is, we really didn't want to give that up. But when it gets to the point that, hey, they didn't surrender when we dropped all of the nuclear weapons we have on them, when that didn't do anything. Now, clock's ticking. Soviets are already in Manchuria, probably into North Korea. Are they going to take the entire peninsula? Or, by the way, the United States is planning the invasion of Japan the way the United States fights wars, which is very logistics heavy, very trying to use firepower and industry to maximize the other side's casualties while minimizing ours. We just got done saying the Soviets don't mind. They'll send a couple million people swimming across from Sakhalin, not putting any thought whatsoever into how you're going to supply them, into how you're going to equip them, just to get them on Japanese soil. And that's a concern of the United States, I think, that we use those diplomatic means to end the war when we did, to basically cut the Soviets off at their knees. We could do that at any point. At any point. In middle of August 1945, before the Soviets get involved, when we realize the nuclear bombs are not going to force surrender.
So do we come to this after Nagasaki then?
Part of me says yes.
Okay.
Part of me says the United States does that so that, and by the way, I mean, we know what I'm talking about. That is not really known. That is not like publicly, historically known. Like, that's not how Oppenheimer ended, as I remember.
No, it's not. Well, and so do we try the diplomacy? Okay, so it's Nagasaki plus, I don't know, a couple of weeks, and we're not hearing anything from them. Soviet Union is they're loading 2 million men onto boats with about 14 rifles and no bullets, and so they're ready to roll. And the Japanese know, and the Japanese at this point had to know that we were planning an invasion. And we say, look, last chance for you to escape with what little your country has left. And by the way, if you agree to this and agree to us occupying, we'll let you keep your emperor.
Mm-hmm. And
which in the real timeline we ultimately did.
We did, and we did it a couple of weeks earlier with the Potsdam Declaration. We just didn't use the emperor. That was the only thing we left out of it. And there was some argument that we should have included that. in the Potsdam Declaration.
Yeah, interesting.
By the way, I looked that number up, Eric, depending on which source you go to, between 300,000 and 400,000 for the U.S. in World War II, almost all military casualties, including civilian casualties for the Soviet Union, approximately 24 million. So we're talking literal orders of magnitude here in terms of difference.
So I think it kind of maybe our final question, or my final question before we wrap this episode up. What about China? What happens to China in this scenario?
Well, we have a couple of different things that might have happened. I think first, the first question is which of those outcomes that we just talked about in Asia actually comes to pass? Do we have a Japanese occupation and surrender in 48, 49? Or do we have a ending of the war in mid-September 45?
I think the ending the war in mid-September of 45 is more likely because, again, we did not want to invade Japan. We would have, but we did not want to do that because we knew how bad it would be. And so I think if the bombs don't work, I think we start really pulling out all the diplomatic stops to say, is there any possible way we can end this before we've forced our own hand into having to go ahead and invade? So I think it still could have happened. The invasion still could have happened, but I think it's more likely that they're gonna, the right person's gonna talk to the right person, and then the Japanese feel like they've got an at least somewhat palatable way out, and they surrender in September. I think is more likely. So then what happens to? And we can talk about. I mean, we can talk about Korea and sort of in the same breath, but let's. But I'm curious about China. Well, what do you guys think would happen to China in this scenario? So
I think.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead. No, you.
So I think we are going to be feeling like we're hurting for friends. I think the U.S. is going to be very concerned about, like we've talked about before, about domino effect. Very concerned about France and Italy. Is there going to be communist uprisings there? I think we want friends, and we will assume that we will rebuild Japan, or the occupation goes very similarly to what it did in our timeline. But China is a mess at this point, and they've all of the different factions have, for the most part, put their differences aside to defeat the Japanese, but those differences still very much exist. And so what does that mean for communists versus nationalists, and in the kind of that scramble between 45 and 49 when the People's Republic was established? It's a lot, like you were saying before, a lot happened in less than 4 years with that. But was that inevitable? Was Mao always going to win?
No,
I don't think so either.
And I think one of the key points is this. I at one point, my boss was Taiwanese. Her family was nationalist, and found it very interesting that I would talk about the Russo-Japanese War, which was a war fought between two foreign countries in China that they never learned about. And the reason I bring that up is, hey, Manchuria is part of China today, and that is where the Russians invaded.
Yeah,
in August of 1945. And one of the things that happened is the United States loaded Chiang's troops onto planes and flew them into major Manchurian cities so that China could keep the claim on that area, and therefore, encourage the Russians to withdraw. If you look at how the Chinese Civil War played out, Mao didn't mount up in Manchuria as kind of a safe haven under the protection of Soviet troops and move south. He came out of Yan'an, which is kind of over more towards Mongolia.
Yeah.
And there's an argument that's been made that it was that overextension that led to the sweep of Mao into power. If
Okay.
Chang isn't scared about Russians in Manchuria, he doesn't need to overextend like that.
Or does he stay in the South? And are there two states?
I'm not even sure if there's two states, but I would say the South state, Hainan stays nationalist.
Yes. Agreed.
Southern China definitely stays. Maybe he's able to reunify because, like you said, let's face it, if the United States, NATO was formed in when? 49.
49.
The United States goes through a period here where we demobilize a lot. And it's the formation of NATO in 49 and the Korean War that gets us to rebuild the military and retool and keep that presence and keep that military complex built.
Right.
If we're looking like we were just saying, and this is why I was like, wait a second, let's go to Asia before we talk about and finish Europe. If we're looking at a 47 NATO,
yeah,
we are looking at a United States that is forward facing while Chang is still in power.
Right. And that's exactly,
it's too late.
Exactly. And so I think by 47, I think the US is overtly supporting Chang.
Mm-hmm.
And so I agree with you. I think the only question at that point is there a People's Republic in Manchuria, or does he unite everything? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the only question.
Well, and where all that plays out, obviously, is how this sort of started. You have a limited number of resources to allocate for all of these places you're looking to allocate, right? We talked about, the reallocation of forces in Europe and the other things that are there. But to your point, Eric, you still have resources to allocate in the post-World War if you didn't have the stomach to do them quite as much because you've just gone through that. But if you stay more on that forward-looking, forward-leaning, the conflict is not over. It's just shifting around posture in 46 and 47, but you also then have more of the threat in Europe. You're now trying to make decisions about where you're willing to accept consolidation, where you're willing to put your chips down, that type of thing. And it's the Asia-Europe balance. Back to Chris's point here, what's going on in these two things all the way through. And Eric, I think you said it well. We're looking for friends. We're looking for friends in Asia. Because we need friends to carry their own fight versus us having to carry that fight for you at some point.
And so I think if we have most or all of a Republic of China that is U.S. aligned, we've rebuilt Japan, then I think Asia doesn't look so bad for us at this point, and so that maybe is a little more stabilizing. And like you said, issues of stability in Asia affect our perception of Europe. And so maybe I'm actually gonna change my mind. I think I agree with Chris. So Chris and Robert said, they didn't think World War III was inevitable, and I thought it was. But I think after really gaming this out, I have to change my mind and agree with Chris and Robert. I don't think it's inevitable at this point. I think you have a more isolated Soviet Union. They have fewer allies. And so, there's containment there. If China is largely nationalist, there's also no support for Ho Chi Minh, right? Or not as much support. Maybe he gets Russian support, but I don't think there's as much support for Ho Chi Minh. So I don't know that I don't know that Vietnam goes the same way, at least not communist. Now, maybe it would still be there'd be a nationalist consolidation, but I don't think we'd be bothered by that. I think we'd be fine with nationalist consolidation as long as they were fairly friendly to us.
Well, Eric, that's not even touching on the fact that before it's Vietnam, it's French Indochina, right?
French Indochina, yeah. So we've got a little while.
How is this even changed by the the complexion of Europe in our revised complexion of Europe after the Second World War in terms of the French and how they view these colonial and territorial assets around the world.
That's very true. That's very true. So I am jumping ahead a good 20 years,
Yeah.
but
And I want to tease something here.
okay.
I think we might, we're coming up on an hour. That's when we like to wrap it up. I think I want to tease one more thing.
Okay.
In 1945-46, the United States demobilized.
Okay.
Largely. We dismantled our military and all of these things. And like we just talked about, one of the outcomes of that was that when Chiang, our ally on the Asian continent, was seriously threatened, we lacked either the resources or the will to back him to the hilt. That led to McCarthyism, 100%. There was the argument that it was communist traitors in the American government that dropped our weapons. And if the United States maintains this forward posture, communism is still a horrible thing, but maybe it's not turned against internal political, it's not grafted onto internal, honest political debates within the American body politic.
Okay, so is there then in the U.S. a little more tolerance for, we'll call it leftward thinking that was not tolerable at all, not communist thinking, but just what we would consider to be left leaning, that would make you concerned that somebody is not necessarily full communists, but they're not red. But so what do they call those people?
No, I think there's still Taft-Hartley type of things. There's still some purges of, well, gee, it's great that we're talking about this right before the Oscars, because purging of people like Oppenheimer, how many times have we brought him up?
That's true.
He's very leftist, and I think people that are out there are probably still getting security clearances denied. But George freaking Marshall is not getting questioned. Okay?
No.
We could say that.
No, George Marshall is not getting questioned. So there's interesting some changes to the U.S. politics as well. I could see that. So
and even the economic impact of a war where the U.S. is still devoting some of its resources towards maintaining a higher level of readiness when it comes to the military, the investments that are going there versus, the post-World War II, the way that I always think about it, the U.S. suddenly has this, yes, we slide into the Cold War, but there's this peace dividend, and everybody, the GIs are returning home, and all the stuff that we think of as being, what becomes the baby boom generation, and what happens economically inside the United States, and also in Western Europe because of the Marshall Plan and how all that sort of came together. I think is somewhat different if you're diverting. Again, it's a resource thing. You're diverting resources now for good reasons to support your allies in China and the different structure of Europe. You don't have quite as much ability to be as domestic focused as you were able to be, even while you were still looking at a Soviet Union and the start of the Cold War. There was still a lot more of a domestic dividend that was paid because you weren't continuing to fund the same level of military readiness. Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, I'm gonna change. I think I know what Eric's gonna say, but I'm gonna say something that's gonna change his answer right now, which is this. What is one of the things we're going to spend this military research on? Space.
Yeah.
So we're gonna move up all of that stuff. So while we may not see peace dividends in everybody having a Studebaker, we are going to see peace dividends in that investments in STEM being moved up and what that leads to.
Well, and I think you have an early consolidation of those efforts, which is a good thing, because and Chris and I did an episode about this. I mean, the Army had a space program, the Navy had a space program. There's all these different, and they were rudimentary by today's standards, but they were still programs. And so I think you get a much earlier consolidation into a either NASA or a NASA-like entity. And we now gain the edge in the space race. So do we beat the Russians to space? Are we in space by 1955? Maybe.
So, like I was kind of trying to tease up earlier, we've got U.S. domestic politics. We got what this does to the third world. We've got the space race. We've got all of these things. We've rewritten the entire 1950s.
Yeah, we
To
have.
do this justice, we need to do another episode.
Well,
Part 3.
Yeah, and where I want to focus, and I agree, where I want to focus on that is also a little bit of the longer tails of this, because what we see now on our current map and our current geopolitics globally is a China that the China we have today and the China that we would have under this scenario, I think, are very different Chinas. And the long tail of this, the 50, 60, 70-year tail of this becomes a very different story as well, and how we get there along the way becomes interesting. I'm okay with revisiting this topic every 6 to 8 episodes, because it just has all the ways that it goes, the ways that it plays. But again, it's that what I love about the idea of alternate history and the idea of the butterfly effect is I wouldn't have thought we would have gotten there just by changing the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
That was not what immediately came to mind for me as all of these things flowing off of that. It was a little bit of difference in Europe. Well, a little bit of difference in Europe sprinkles in a little bit of difference here and a little bit of difference there. And the next thing you know, you got an entirely different dish created with an entirely different set of ingredients over time.
Absolutely. And we've we talked a little bit about deeper into the future, but we've kind of stopped our discussions right around 1949. I think if we do a third part of this, I think we pick back up in 1950.
And by the way, I in my mind, I'm envisioning like the theme of this third episode being Barbenheimer, and we bring it all together with American consumer culture. And yes, it works so well.
I'm in.
And Don rolls his eyes.
Well, it's when you said Barbenheimer, of course, the immediate thing that pops into my head. I know you're making the Barbie reference there, but that sounds like the start of barbecue as well. I know that's going to lead us to places that'll just read. That's a Cold War that runs deep on this podcast. That's all I'll say. It's a Cold War that runs deep. All right, guys, I always enjoy visiting with you. By the way, we let some listeners listen to us along the way, because that's what I think of about this as being is we would have done this just for ourselves once we got introduced, but we let the world peek into this. I do want to make reference to, I know, Eric, you mentioned on the last episode, our plan is to target our live stream, our next live stream 2 is, by the way, what I'm calling it, or live stream 200, because we're going to target around the 200 episode. Is probably going to target if we time out a weekly episode distribution, which we're getting back on being pretty good about. We're a couple of days late from time to time, but we're getting back in our flow there. That throws us to the late Marchish time frame. So we'll be lining that up. So we'll be very soon beginning to pin down a date. And you'll see probably in the next couple of episodes some links in the show notes there that will take you to like a registration page or an information page on our website. Just to tease our listeners again, the idea of what we're talking about, they're doing a couple of different things. But one of them, do some sort of games that are embedded into the episode too. We've got some idea about how to make that fun in real time that we aren't able to do. But the idea is to actually do an episode that is like based on, here's the 5 choices that we give to our listeners that show up and they vote in real time. And then we have to jump in and do it. And so what you would see on that live stream, Eric's made reference to it. We've talked about a number of times. You'd see the little bit of pre-episode banter that we do, how we sort of set that up, because we would have just, okay, now this is what we're going to talk about. Who's going to talk about what? What do you think? Then you'd see us roll into an episode. So if you're on the live stream, you will see a different experience than when we actually roll out the episode, because the episode will roll out as an episode and we'll roll out the live stream separately, but you'll sort of see if you're interested to see how sausage gets put together, you're going to see some sausage getting made in this process before it's all said and done. And of course, we'll dig a little bit deeper and learn a little bit more about the team and the other things as we go along there. And I'm really looking forward to that. We had fun on the first one, but we have a lot more momentum now. I've mentioned it a couple of times. I have to plug it again because it develops a little bit of momentum, but we keep having to give it some momentum. Check out our Discord server. go there. Every episode we post sort of a place for feedback there, and we get good feedback now. We have 5 or 6 very active members of our community that, will comment on anything and give good suggestions back. And there's some good discussion that goes on there. And part of what we've talked about incorporating into future episodes is almost like I almost want to call it viewer mail, but it's sort of talking about some of those comments that are in Discord. So if you have some comments about this episode, go to the Discord server, put your comments there. And when we come back around for that 3rd episode, it's a chance for us to say, Helena, for example, I know it's one of our listeners in the UK. This is her comment on this, or some of the other folks that are there. I'm really enjoying that interaction there and what goes on there. So if you're not part of that and you enjoy what goes on here, there's a place to sort of do this in real time. The team does a pretty good job of checking in there in terms of what's going on as well. So visit us on the Discord server, and we promise we're not selling secrets to anybody there. Don't get caught up in that Discord kind of thing. We're doing only legitimate stuff on our Discord server. So I value very much Eric and Chris and the other members of the team. Guys, you have anything you want to say before we close out here and we get on to the rest of our night and then on to the week that lays ahead of us?
No, I think we teed up a part 3 really nicely, and inadvertently.
Yeah, we do that. It's this thing about history. It keeps spawning new things as we move along.
It does.
And Chris, with your permission, do you mind sharing with me the picture that you shared in the banter? I'm going to throw that on our Discord channel as well, which gives you an idea where you'll see what Chris passed today. He's actually on the road today. In fact, one of the things we'll be keeping track of probably throughout this year is Chris is going to be doing a lot of traveling for work. And so he may set the record for locations from which a participant has joined a recording session. He added to the list here today. So if you want to share that, Chris, I'll throw it up on the Discord server. I'm not going to give anything more than that. That's your tease to go check out what it is. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but if you're a listener and you want to know, you'll see it there.
I did that. I also feel like I'm gonna put something together for Eric Rush's favorite travel story for Wyoming.
Well, and I will just say when I post the map that we've made reference to here that Dylan did since he couldn't join us, pay very close attention to the map. That's all I'm going to say. All right, guys. I appreciate you. We appreciate our listeners, guys. Have a great week. Listeners, have a great week too. We'll see you next time. Signing out. If you find a fork in history, we suggest you take it.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.